I guess I might start by talking about where the talks are happening. We are in the cradle of mankind, the very continent where humanity started. We are in the most vulnerable continent, but we're a continent that is also the least responsible for climate change. A continent that is already reeling from the impacts of climate change. We are all too familiar with the drought that is devastating the peoples and livelihoods of millions of people in East Africa. That is something that is too real, and all of us are quite familiar with the economic, with the social and environmental cost of climate change on Africa. In the back of this, Africa is privileged to be hosting the United Nations Climate Conference in the city of Durban. At the back of these talks, we've had what the developed country parties, and in this case particularly the so-called progressive European Union, the positions that it has taken. I want to underline a couple of positions that the EU have taken. One such position is what EU calls a commitment on the second commitment period that needs to be accompanied by hard commitments by the developing countries. This is a group that has traditionally been seen to be playing a progressive role, but has actually had an explicit strategy, a very explicit strategy to sit on the fence, allowing the likes of Canada, Japan, and Russia to undermine the Kyoto Protocol, and in undermining the Kyoto Protocol, actually playing out the clock for their second commitment period. The same EU says that it requires a mandate to negotiate a global treaty as if we didn't have a global treaty. We're all too aware that we have a global treaty in the name of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and so it's not for the absence of international climate treaties, it's actually for the lack of implementations of those treaties that the EU is now coming out to say that it requires a mandate to be able to negotiate a global treaty that is going to include all countries. What are they actually trying to do? And I think this is the thing we should try and understand. In my sense, in my opinion, actually they're trying to transition out of the Kyoto Protocol. While we're all aware of the case of Canada, Japan, and Russia, who want to do that immediately, at least in the case of the EU, they want to do that in the future. How they're doing it and playing out between their strategy, but also their public position, is such that they've let the likes of Canada, Japan, and Russia to do the dirty work for them. And the intention is actually to conclude the negotiations for the Kyoto Protocol, to coincide with the mandate to negotiate a new treaty under a new process. And I want to underline this because in their minds, it's not going to be under the long-term cooperative action. It's going to be under a new process that they would like to establish here in Durban under the Durban mandate. The EU is demanding hard commitments from other major economies as a precondition. But let's think of what these preconditions are. These preconditions actually depart from EU's own legal obligations. EU's legal obligation established under the Kyoto Protocol Article 3.9 is actually to negotiate a subsequent commitment period to the Kyoto Protocol. And in the Bali roadmap, which was agreed in 2007, the deal was for developed country parties to continue with the Kyoto Protocol and for the US to do comparable efforts and for developing countries to do actions which are nationally appropriate mitigation actions. But the plan that was to keep KP and to lift the US to join the developed country parties that are parties to the Kyoto Protocol is now being discarded. And we're now seeing a race to the bottom. And this race to the bottom is one that is going to allow actually for the adoption of the lowest common denominator in terms of emissions reduction commitment, but also in terms of finance commitments, and also in terms of the accounting rules that need to be agreed. So what will this result in? At the very least, it will result in the further delay of the implementation of the UNFCCC Convention. And it will actually enable developed country parties that are parties to the Kyoto Protocol to jump ship from the Kyoto Protocol. And in jumping ship from the Kyoto Protocol, which is the only legally binding emissions reduction treaty that we have, they will be jumping to a weaker, if we ever end up agreeing to one, but one that will result in weaker commitments for them. The very same process might actually also result in very unreasonable, stronger commitments for the developing countries. I want to use the analogy that is in the Holy Scriptures. Prophet Noah and his ark, which he used to save humanity from the calamity of the flooding. We now have a case where the developed country parties are building their ark, but actually stopping the developing countries from building their own. And what are we ending up with? They're getting baited with finance, and that we've seen in the Cancun Accord, which has hardly been delivered. But we're now seeing a situation where, in the case of some EU countries, baiting particularly some of the stronger African leaders and asking them to be flexible. And you can think of what it means to be flexible for a continent that is facing some of the climate impact that we've all seen. So this is a deal that they would like to cut. But what is it that is going to get the job done and that is going to secure the lives, livelihoods, and the well-being of the people of Africa, but also in other vulnerable countries of the world? To start with, it's the things that have been said by other panelists, which is the second and, I will add, subsequent commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol. Because the Kyoto Protocol, like we've had in the past, is not yogurt that expires and comes with an expiry date. And the legal commitments for developed country parties that have signed up to the Kyoto Protocol is actually to agree to second and subsequent commitment period. And we'd like to see actually ambitious science-based emissions reductions targets taken on by these countries so that they will be able to deliver the level of emissions reductions that will be sufficient to keep the world safe. And then secondly, on the part of the US, which continues to actually delay the negotiations by coming with conditions that it knows quite well are not in line with the current convention, and is actually pushing to rewrite the very convention to take on comparable efforts with other developed country parties. And then we will require an agreement that will respect the principles and provisions of the convention and will cover in a very balanced manner, not just mitigation, because the pursuit here is not just emissions reductions, but also the delivery of the finance, of the technology, and other resources that developing countries require to adapt and to be able to develop cleanly by transitioning to a low-carbon pathway. We've heard about the Green Climate Fund, but we don't want just the operationalization of the Green Climate Fund. We want the capitalization of that fund. So we don't want to see an empty shell coming out. We would like a fund that has in it the resources that will help deliver the adaptation actions, that will deliver the low-carbon development strategy that developing countries are developing. But we'll also require the other institutions that have been agreed in Cancun, including the adaptation framework, the standing committee that will allow for the delivery of support that will also be able to allow these countries to be able to develop. There's something that is important, given the fact that we're in Africa, I should actually underline. The fact that we're not going to cut a deal on the back of the lives of the people of this continent. I think it's about time parties actually took seriously their obligations and started thinking of how best they would prevent dangerous climate change. And in preventing dangerous climate change, actually, of providing the support that the poor countries require to adapt. I guess you've seen, there was a report actually in today's media in Durban, reporting last night's floods that killed 6 people here in the coast of South Africa. I don't think there's anything more foretelling of the impacts of climate change that we will be seeing if parties do not actually prepare themselves for those eventualities and help deliver an ambitious outcome. So we need to be putting these messages out there to the parties during these 2 weeks so that we can be able to compel them to deliver not just agreement, but an agreement that will get the job done and that will be able to secure the survival of humanity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we all agree that our panelists have given us a very rich analysis, focus on what should be happening and what could happen that would be actually quite dangerous for these 2 weeks. We have about 10 to 15 minutes, so I'm sure there are comments, questions. If you have, please raise your hand and introduce yourself.